The idea, as you can see from the title, is going to be twofold. First is, with mobile apps being able to track your location constantly throughout your day in the background, there is some exposure to potential risk that information can be used by firms. But at the same time, it can create value for firms who may be able to target you better or may be able to plan their business better. So the first idea of the paper is, can we quantify how much additional value geo-tracking data would bring for a firm relative to just using some aggregate consumer level demographics or even information about their past behaviors and past purchases. So the first part of the paper, I'm going to collect data from a safe driving app, which observes people's driving behavior for an entire year, and then try to predict visits in the restaurant setting. So my industry will be restaurants. The second thing that I will do then, which may be of more interest to this session, is about the privacy trade-offs. We know that a ton of regulatory move is going on right now to limit what data can be tracked about consumers, in what form it can be tracked, where they can be tracked. And so in my privacy counterfactuals, I will restrict geo-tracking data and then re-estimate the models and see, well, what is the loss in value under these various restrictions that firms may be exposed to by virtue of regulation or by virtue of consumers' own actions. I don't know how many of you use the while app is on, only then track my location. Do you all set that setting for locations? You don't want them to be tracking you all the time, but that may also give firms snapshots of where you are, even though they may not be continuous. So I'm going to try to see what will be the impact of those types of restrictions on the prediction that firms can get out of this type of data. So the motivation is, I guess, in one line, consumer geo-tracking can be valuable to firms, and a lot of companies do that already, but it creates privacy concerns. So if you think about apps today, most companies have their own proprietary apps that can track your GPS coordinates. If not, then there is enough infrastructure in the location economy that you can buy this kind of data as a firm. At the same time, there are privacy concerns too. We know that California Privacy Rights Act has categorically said location data is sensitive information. GDPR does similar imposes restrictions on web tracking in EU and beyond. And so what we really try to do is first quantify in one specific application what will be the value of these data for predicting consumers' future behaviors. And second, if we restrict geo-tracking data, what would be the loss in accuracy, so to say. And why restaurant industry? So one reason is restaurants often have access to these kinds of data, both through their own apps as well as third-party deals apps, as well as apps that can do delivery. So we know that restaurants have access to this type of data if they want it. And then the second thing we know also, which was kind of the whole push in our review process, can you show how a restaurant could use these data in practice? So I went ahead and interviewed about 10 different restaurant managers. I conducted these in-depth interviews on Zoom, and most of them included fast food restaurants like Jimmy John's, but also fine dining restaurants. And they said that we would love to have an algorithm that can tell us what customers are going to walk in, particularly repeat customers, so we can serve them better. I know one of the fine dining owners in Atlanta even said that if I knew somebody's relationship status, I can create a unique experience for them in my restaurants. And a lot of them actually in their reservation system may not track that. So we want to see what would be the value of bringing in this additional data and using it for predicting every customer's visit. Again, you could do this exercise at a more aggregate level, which would then tell you how many customers are going to walk in. But in this application, we are focusing on individual level predictions for each week. And one of the other things that came out of these interviews, which I'm not showing here, was restaurants are making a ton of decisions on a weekly basis. So they want to know ahead of time what to plan for their ingredients, for staffing, for weekly specials, for targeting customers. So the goal here is going to be, we're going to use these types of information about consumers, especially focusing on geo-tracking over and above past behaviors, which is past restaurant visits to either the same restaurant or others in the same category, and also demographics, which we'll start with baseline demographics that are collected by the app, age, gender, gender, and also then add on census block level household characteristics about income, employment, education, and then we'll also add location information, because even if you don't know the home address of a consumer, if you know the zip code where they live, that might tell the restaurant this is how far they are from our store, and they're likely to visit based on their location. So I'll show you results with and without home zip code location as well. And then we'll use a machine learning framework, which I'll describe in detail, and then use that to predict whether a customer will visit a given restaurant in a given week. So all the predictions are at the individual level for a given restaurant week. Now, what are we going to do with the privacy framework? This is where the interesting results come from restricting geo-tracking data and then re-estimating the models to try to see what is now the relative accuracy with which we can predict under the different restrictions we impose. So 2 research questions: what is the predictive value of tracking? And we do this in the restaurant industry for predicting future visits. Again, remember, this is going to be a machine learning framework, so different set of consumers, different time period than what the model is trained on, to make sure it's a generalizable model. The second thing which we do is, what is the trade-off, like Uzma said, of restricting geo-tracking data. Particularly, we're going to draw from industry practices and privacy policy and the privacy literature to propose 4 different types of restrictions. The first is, what data are geo-tracked? So you could think of geo-tracking data as just coordinates, all latitude and longitude information, or figuring out very private information like home addresses from those coordinates. What we do under this restriction is we create summary level features which are aggregated at the user level to be able to protect their privacy. In the second restriction, which is more to Aparna's presentation, which users are tracked. And here we're going to restrict tracking of only users above a certain age so that the underage users are not tracked in order to protect them. And then where users are tracked. So in practice, most firms have some kind of a geofence around their store, or they may be able to only access certain location. And so in this counterfactual, what we're going to do is restrict tracking to only those users who are within certain distance of the specific restaurant we're predicting for. And the final set, which is based on consumers' own actions, is how frequently you can track them. In the original data set that we have, we observe very high frequency at every 3 minutes. But in the lower frequency counterfactual, we take 1/10 of the data frequency, or half the frequency, and re-estimate our models. Okay, so just a preview of results in case I don't get to the end. And Uzma, you can tell me to stop.
I will let you go to the end.
So the predictive value of consumer geo-tracking data for this application, we find there's a 14.8% increase in accuracy relative to just baseline demographic with no location information. So when I say baseline, it's age, gender, all the household level characteristics, which are more privacy preserving. The minute we add location information about where they live in terms of just a rough idea of their zip code, even that is pretty powerful. And their behavior information of where they went in the past, then we see the geo-tracking data is still more useful, but by 3.1% more.
Just 14.8% of what again? I may have missed that.
So suppose I can predict with 70% accuracy that you're going to go to this restaurant. I can predict with 14% more accuracy if I include geo-tracking data in the prediction model. That's a good question.
That's good.
Okay, perfect. So the result on the counterfactuals, which really kind of add richness in my view to what we learned from this paper, is there's a huge range of how different restrictions impact predictions, going from anywhere between 2% to 14% loss in prediction performance. So if we used complete geo-tracking data in the full model with all the features, and then take away the geo-tracking data by restricting it under different privacy counterfactuals, we lose the prediction accuracy, which is expected. But what's really interesting is there's a huge range, 2 to 14%, depending on how you restrict the data. So the restrictions that make the biggest dent in value to the firm are restrictions that limit what information is tracked. Instead of raw geo-coordinates, if we only let companies track summaries of at the individual level, which are aggregated, they don't benefit as much. And the second one is if we restrict where people are tracked. So if I limit tracking to only, say, 10 miles or 1 mile within the radius of the restaurant, we lose a lot of value that the prediction was gaining from these geo-tracking data. But interestingly, how frequently we track them doesn't matter so much. So companies don't need to track us every 3 minutes. They could be just as well off by limited tracking at static locations, or maybe once every 30 minutes or something like that, which has implications for both how consumers might feel about tracking and also the data storage needs, which can grow enormously as companies need more and more data. So just a little aside about the implications that I really found interesting in this project. In terms of regulations, there's already a lot of work that looks at the effect of these regulations on online tracking, online advertisements effectiveness. And we draw from this work to then get to, Uzma, your point about the various restrictions and the way they can protect consumers. Like this is the act to just protect children. And Dinara, your work probably draws on children's content. Garrett Johnson and Tess Reeland have a paper looking at YouTube content for kids to try to protect kids on YouTube. And the age-appropriate design code is another one, which then obviously these regulations are assuming too that younger people are more vulnerable, even though they may be themselves not valuing privacy so much. So there are, I guess, policy moves to regulate collection of these data. In some sense, that's kind of Big Brother because we're assuming, well, you should care about privacy even if you're young and you don't care about sharing all this data on the internet. And then, of course, geographical and frequency restrictions that I already described. So that's the motivation for a lot of the privacy restrictions here. Okay, data, which is the exciting part, is very, very rich data at the individual level from a safe driving app in Texas. We have about 38,000 users, which is 120 million driving data points for over a year. And this app automatically turns on in the background every time you start driving. So it's not like users have to open the app. Anytime you're over 10 miles an hour, it can detect you're in a car, you're on the road, and it turns on. So we get continuous stream of data about their driving each time they're on the road. We also have individual level demographics at the time of sign up, their age, gender, zip code, and we use those in addition to some more household level data on average income, household size, population, and so on. The driving data are really the rich part of this project, where we compute specific distance metrics from these GPS points that are tracked at every 3 minutes. So we compute their exact home location that I'll show you in a second without revealing anybody's names or anything like that. We don't have access to that. And then I will also show you how far off people are driving from a typical restaurant in our data set. Okay, perfect. So this is the app which helps us visualize the kind of data that comes from it. I'm showing you two users. I'm going to show you a bunch of figures to give you a sense of what richness we can learn from these data. So this is one user, and this is a different user on the same day. Every time they stop for 10 minutes, there's a black dot, and when they stop at a restaurant, it's a red dot. And you can see how different their patterns look, even just on the same day. And their preferences for restaurants may also be different, which tells me maybe there's something we can learn about these. And when I look at the richness of these tracking data, these users are all over Texas. And just from their trajectories, we can figure out their exact home locations. And for each of their home location, I can also map their distance to the restaurant, which is what gives us all this richness. The one thing I should mention is that we are able to use only restaurants that are standalone. So if there is a Subway within Walmart, we will exclude those cases because then it's possible that they actually went into Walmart or they went into a mall. So the restaurant week sample that we use is going to be only those restaurants that are standalone. And how do we know that? We get data from SafeGraph and look at the geometries of the restaurant polygons. The second thing that I want to show you, this is a little bit more complicated, so I'll explain a little slower. This is all of their driving features are mapped onto these points. Each point is a specific user, and the color codes that you see are based on high trip distance. So if somebody is very far from a given restaurant, and this is for Starbucks for a given week, if they're very far, it's colored in that maroon, and they cluster more around the top part. If they're close by, then you'll see it more in a purple shade. And if I map their entire driving trajectory for that week on a heat map, I can actually start to see that these patterns will make sense, because people who have very low trip distances tend to stay within a city. So if you know anything about Texas, this is a small city called Katy, close enough to Houston, and this person who has low trip distances is staying close enough to Katy, whereas a person who has very far off distances is actually traveling between 3 cities, spending most of their time in College Station. So you can start to get a sense of their heat maps of their driving pattern just by looking at their geo-trajectory features. And that's the set we'll use for prediction of where they're going to go next. The machine learning framework is pretty simple. We split by users, we split by time. We do this on a rolling basis. So take week 1's data, predict week 2 for a different set of customers. Take week 2 data, learn the model, predict week 3. And that's the rolling window we follow, which is again similar to Chen Shu's paper. And the main idea is here, we're comparing these different feature sets and training the model with them. And then finally, the numbers I will show you are all out of sample reported for the test users. And then we repeat this entire approach with restricted geo-tracking data for each of the restrictions that we impose. I think I covered everything. Any questions about this part? Okay. Perfect. So we should get to the results then. I'll show you results for 6 models. So very soon it'll be slides with a lot of numbers. Just to prime you for that, baseline demographics will be age, gender, and the household characteristics. We'll start adding some location information. Home zip code is a crude measure of how far the restaurant is from the center of your zip code, as presumably more privacy preserving than the exact home tracked distance, which will be the latitude, longitude of where you live. We recover from the geo-tracking data and then recalculate the distance to the focal restaurant that we're predicting for, which is presumably more granular and more invasive. And then obviously we'll add behavioral information. The difference between model 4, 5, and 6 are the ones that use geo-tracking. The way geo-tracking enters the model is either by looking at home tracked and trip distance, or by also looking at the raw geo-coordinates. And what I'll show you is adding these huge sequences of geo-coordinates in the model doesn't help as much. So model 5 will end up being the best model. You don't need all this geo-coordinate data. You're better off by just looking at the exact home distances and the trip distances where people are driving. Okay, I said a lot of things. Time to show you the results. So just baseline demographics do pretty well. And again, remember, we're predicting a very sparse outcome. So we're going to use class balancing. So your baseline, you can think of it as a random 50% chance. Just demographics actually do a pretty good job. And what happens when we add on more information? So the biggest jump you will see is here. Simply adding the distance between the home zip code centroid and the restaurant can get you 76.1% prediction. And then behavioral information on top of it doesn't capture much, which to me was a bit of a surprising information. And I tried kind of different combinations of it. I also looked at baseline with behavioral. So just demographic and behavior, it doesn't improve much. So what was interesting to me is that home location where you live, just in a very crude form with zip code, helps more than where you went in the past. Then when we add the geo-tracking information on where you live precisely and the trip distances of where you drive relative to the restaurant, we start seeing even more increases, 78.6 and 79.07, which is our best performing model. And this itself is about 14% higher than baseline and about, I think, 4% higher than this one. So for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to focus on model 5, which shows me that adding geo-tracking data in addition to baseline demographics can be very useful.
Can I just ask?
The last result here is trip distance and home distance matter the most, which are both part of the driving set. So the last results I already kind of showed you, I explained them to you in the summary, is the biggest drop happens when we talk about summarizing at the user level and when we talk about tracking within a certain geofence. It doesn't matter if you're tracking at reduced frequencies, you are still actually above the baseline for most of them. Pretty much all of them are above the baseline, which tells us, and it tells managers, that you may be better off by tracking less frequent data, even better than baseline demographics. So if you have the choice between no tracking at all and tracking some geo information, it's better to go with some information. So the results really showed that overall we have a 3% increase in prediction accuracy when we use these geo-tracking data, and 14.8% if we're comparing just to baseline demographics with no location at all. And the decrease depends on the type of policy restriction we impose. And what this means for managers is that, I'm skipping 2 slides, that less geo-tracking still performs better than no geo-tracking at all. And this can also mean that policy restrictions and regulators can preempt what would be the impact of some of these policies towards managing both the regulatory and the public backlash against tracking. Tim Hortons is a good case, actually, Uzma. That reminds me, because their app was secretly tracking people without their consent. So they faced a lot of backlash in Canada, even though there was no actual litigation. So that's an interesting. Thank you for giving me extra time, and thank you for all the questions.
Thank you. So we'll take